Welcome to Serial Killer Files by Scoob. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're exploring something that has captivated and horrified audiences for over 5 decades: the recorded interviews of Charles Manson. What you're about to hear isn't just the story of a criminal. It's a masterclass in manipulation, a study in how charisma can be weaponized, and perhaps most disturbing of all, a glimpse into how ordinary people can be led to commit extraordinary evil. Charles Manson died on November 19, 2017, at the age of 83. But the recordings he left behind, from 1972 to 1993, and even secret prison conversations that have only recently surfaced, offer us an unprecedented window into the mind of a man who became more than a killer. He became a symbol of how dangerous human influence can truly be. But here's what makes this exploration different. We're not just going to tell you what Manson did. You probably already know about the brutal murders of Sharon Tate and the LaBiancas in 1969. Instead, we're going to dissect how he spoke, why his words held such power, and what his constantly shifting personas reveal about the nature of evil itself. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that emerges from studying these interviews. Charles Manson wasn't the raving madman that popular culture often portrays. He was something far more terrifying, a calculating performer who understood exactly how to exploit human vulnerability. Let's start at the beginning, because understanding who Charles Manson was requires us to trace his transformation from Charles Mills Maddox, a troubled kid born in Cincinnati, Ohio on November 12, 1934, into the cult leader who would orchestrate some of America's most infamous murders. Manson's early life reads like a textbook case of how not to raise a child. He ran away repeatedly, cycled through juvenile reformatories, and spent his youth committing petty crimes. But something changed when he was released from prison in 1967. He moved to California and began gathering followers, mostly young people drawn to his charisma, his promises of an unconventional lifestyle, and yes, his liberal use of drugs. This wasn't just random magnetism. Manson had a target demographic, and he understood them perfectly. He sought out the lost, the rejected, the socially outcast. These weren't inherently evil people. They were vulnerable human beings looking for acceptance, love, and purpose. Manson offered them all three, but at a price they couldn't have imagined. What's fascinating is that Manson initially had legitimate aspirations. He pursued music, even connecting with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. They actually recorded a version of one of his songs, though Manson received no credit. That rejection, that sense of failure in the legitimate world, seems to have pushed him deeper into his role as a cult leader. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. In 1969, under Manson's orders, his followers committed a series of brutal murders. Sharon Tate, 8.5 months pregnant, was killed, along with others in her house, on August 8th. The next night, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca met the same fate. Additional victims included musician Gary Hinman and ranch hand Donald "Shorty" Shea. The legal case that followed was groundbreaking. Even though Manson didn't personally kill most of the victims, prosecutors successfully argued that his ideology and instructions made him ultimately responsible. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy, originally sentenced to death, though this was later commuted to life imprisonment when California invalidated its death sentences in 1972. What's remarkable is how Manson's behavior in prison revealed the calculating nature behind his public persona. He remained defiant, constantly violated rules, threatened guards. At one parole hearing, he stated, "I'm special. I'm not like the average inmate. I have spent my life in prison. I have put 5 people in the grave. I am a very dangerous man." Even that statement reveals his strategic thinking. He's not just confessing, he's positioning himself as uniquely dangerous, someone who deserves special consideration, someone whose very presence commands respect through fear. Now let's dive into what made Manson truly dangerous. Not his physical presence, but his mastery of language as a tool of domination. When researchers analyzed his interviews from 1972 to 1993, they discovered something chilling. His interpersonal style was consistently dominant and cold. Listen to how Manson spoke, and you'll hear a pattern. His sentences were packed with I, I'm, I got, I make, I deal, verbs of control and possession. He positioned himself as the center of all action and meaning in every conversation. But here's where it gets really sophisticated. When asked simple, direct questions, Manson almost never answered directly. Instead, he would launch into long, meandering monologues filled with metaphors and symbolic language. When asked about his identity, he once said, "I'm nobody. I'm a tramp, a bum, a hobo. I'm a boxcar and a jug of wine, and a straight razor if you get too close to me." Notice what's happening here. That answer doesn't inform. It immerses the listener in a chaotic persona that's equal parts vagabond, danger, and defiance. Words like boxcar, jug of wine, straight razor create vivid mental pictures, not logical statements. Researchers have described this as a kind of psychedelic dialectic, a hypnotic verbal flow that overwhelms logical analysis and encourages emotional response rather than rational thinking. Combined with his pauses, stutters, and occasional rhetorical questions, this created a rhythm that fluctuated between calm, hypnotic speech and unsettling unpredictability. The genius, and I use that word carefully, of this approach is that it served multiple purposes simultaneously. It dominated the listener, blurred boundaries, and resisted direct accountability. When you can't pin down what someone actually means, how can you hold them responsible for their words? A 2025 study using continuous assessment methods found that Manson's behavior remained marked by high dominance and low warmth throughout decades of interviews. This wasn't mental illness. This was a deliberate interpersonal strategy. His use of repetition was particularly insidious. Rather than emphasizing points, he used repetition to drown out meaning, confuse listeners, and avoid direct answers. Sentences would repeat ideas or words, shift in tone, or circle around concepts like free associative monologues rather than coherent responses. Even when he tried to appear philosophical or spiritual, his words lacked logical structure. Instead, he offered a blend of mysticism, counterculture jargon, religious references, Beatles lyrics, and science fiction concepts. For vulnerable young people, especially those under the influence of drugs, this mixture felt profound, poetic, emancipatory, even when it made no rational sense whatsoever. One of the most disturbing aspects of studying Manson's interviews is watching how dramatically his persona could shift, sometimes within the same conversation. This wasn't inconsistency, it was strategy. Take his 1994 interview with Diane Sawyer. Here, Manson sounded surprisingly reflective, almost homesick for prison life. He told Sawyer, "I never realized people outside are much different from the people inside. The people inside, if you lie, you get punched." He presented prison as honest and transparent, while hinting that everything outside was fake. In this mode, he sounded like a philosopher, someone deeply disillusioned with society's hypocrisy. He even said, "We watch to be reassured these people are monsters, not at all like you and me, and to face the fear that in some basic ways they are exactly like you and me." That's a remarkably sophisticated psychological observation about why society is fascinated by criminals. But contrast this with his 1986 television interview with Charlie Rose. Manson started friendly enough, greeting Rose with a handshake. "So, Rose, how are you? I've been watching you on the tube." But as Rose pressed him about the murders, Manson's demeanor shifted completely. When asked how he felt about the killings, Manson turned the tables. "How do you feel about them? That's what counts. Happened in your world, not mine." And then came the chilling moral relativism. "See, that doesn't even compute in my world because, there is no wrong." This ability to oscillate between personas, from philosopher to rebel, to prophet to entertainer, was clearly intentional. To journalists, he might sound reflective and reasonable. To followers, he could appear visionary or spiritual. When threatened, he became defiant and hostile. The recently released Making Manson doc-series, featuring decades of previously unheard prison conversations, shows us even more facets. Sometimes Manson speaks softly, with apparent regret, reflecting on childhood abuse and criminal youth. Other times he switches to boasting, defiance, and positioning himself as a misunderstood outsider. What made this persona shifting so effective was its disorienting effect on listeners. By constantly changing his approach, Manson forced people to doubt what was real. Was he sincere in one moment, manipulative in another, or simply acting throughout? That ambiguity became part of his power. As one observer in the recent documentary noted, when left alone with his interlocutor, Manson played into the persona that we were creating. He knew how to adapt to what people expected and exploit that for influence. This uncertainty about his truth helped him mask brutality with charisma, violence with mysticism, guilt with confusion. He turned himself into a living riddle, one that was hard for society to pin down, but dangerously persuasive for those who felt lost, lonely, or searching for meaning. While Manson's words were his primary weapon, those who studied his interviews noted something equally disturbing about his nonverbal communication, specifically his eyes. This wasn't just about having an intense stare. It was about how he weaponized eye contact as a tool of psychological manipulation. Body language analysts who examined his court hearings and interviews observed that Manson often held his eyelids unusually wide open, his right eye more so than his left, with raised eyebrows and flared nostrils. This kind of gaze triggers strong emotional reactions in others. But here's what made it particularly unsettling: the mismatch between his eyes and the rest of his face. His mouth and lower face were often relaxed, even neutral, making the stare feel unnatural and eerie. This uncanny stare grabbed attention, unsettled normal reactions, and potentially made people more susceptible to his words. Watch his 1992 parole hearing, and you'll see this technique in action. Initially, Manson tried to appear vulnerable, telling the board, "I'm a little nervous. I've been a long time sitting in a cell. I'm not used to people that much." But body language experts argue these words were tactical, designed to create pity while masking what they identified as hidden contempt and defiance. When he shifted to direct, intense eye contact during these moments, the stare served as a dominance display, conveying that he wasn't truly submissive but was actually observing and controlling the interaction. But Manson also employed the opposite tactic. When pressured about the murders or asked to admit guilt, he would avoid eye contact entirely. During certain interview segments, he would refuse to look up, showing frustration, or shift his eyes downward when asked about the killings. This alternation between intense stare and complete avoidance was deliberately disorienting. It denied interviewers and audiences a consistent emotional read. One moment he might appear calm and philosophical, his eyes wide and unblinking in a hypnotic stare. The next moment he'd look away, evading the weight of questions about morality or violence. This fits with what researchers know about charismatic manipulators. Some analyses suggest Manson used techniques similar to neurolinguistic programming, creating an appearance of reading minds and controlling followers. A piercing gaze can support that illusion of insight or power. According to body language theory, this kind of psychopathic stare, holding unblinking eye contact, can capture and hold attention, make listeners feel uneasy or exposed, and break down their resistance to persuasion. There's also what psychologists call nonverbal leakage happening here. People skilled in manipulation sometimes attempt to show one set of emotions verbally, perhaps calmness or reflection, while their eyes betray something else entirely: anger, contempt, or fear. We see this documented in his 1981 appearance on The Tomorrow Show, where people described Manson as quietly mesmerizing and disturbingly manic, sometimes breaking into a wild stare and then slipping back into calm. That stark oscillation mirrored his shifting personas and made it impossible to know what he truly felt or meant. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Manson's interview strategy was how he handled direct confrontation about his crimes. When pressed about guilt, victims, or moral responsibility, he deployed a sophisticated set of deflection techniques that allowed him to evade accountability while maintaining his psychological dominance. In that famous 1986 Charlie Rose interview, watch how quickly Manson shifts when the questions get uncomfortable. After initially greeting Rose casually, even with a handshake, he completely flips when asked about the killings. Instead of answering, he turns the tables. How do you feel about them? That's what counts. Happened in your world, not mine. This is deflection at its most sophisticated. Rather than engaging with guilt or remorse, he declares a separation, as if the murders belong to a different reality entirely. When pressed about morality, he rejected the premise altogether. See, that doesn't even compute in my world, because there is no wrong. Most tellingly, he denied ever being a leader. I'm not a leader. I've never been a leader in my life. He minimized his role to almost nothing. I got a motorcycle and I've got a guitar and girls follow me around. When Rose pressed him on being perceived as a monster, Manson became aggressive. I did not direct nobody to be killed, man. The recent recordings featured in the 2024 Making Manson doc-series show these same tactics decades later. He tells his prison contact, "I'm not pretending to be good. I know it was a conspiracy if I'd said something, but I didn't say nothing. I didn't have nothing to do with killing those people." Notice the strategy. He acknowledges that something conspiratorial might have happened if he had said something, but denies saying anything at all. It's a way of seeming to offer insight while actually revealing nothing. He continues, "I don't go to war with innocent people. I don't murder people in their beds." This is deflection through rhetorical reframing. He acknowledges violence exists but denies personal responsibility for it. Instead of directly answering questions about victims or guilt, he offers vague suggestions of conspiracy, misunderstanding, or misunderstood intentions. Researchers analyzing his speech patterns found consistent deflection strategies. When asked about wrongdoing, Manson would use emotive language and figurative examples to shift conversations away from facts and toward emotional appeals. He'd ask interviewers questions about their own guilt. "Are you innocent?" Or, "You know you are guilty," reframing the interview to cast doubt on the interviewer's moral certainty rather than accept any blame. Combined with his persona-shifting and hypnotic speech patterns, these deflection tactics made him nearly impossible to pin down. He could seem lucid and reasonable to some audiences, then erratic and threatening to others. Interviewers found themselves unsure how to interpret him or whether he was serious at all. The effect was to erode the possibility of meaningful accountability. If he sometimes admitted vague involvement in unspecified violence while denying any direct role in the high-profile murders, it becomes impossible to reconstruct a clear, definitive version of events. By deflecting blame, reframing morality, and using philosophical or conspiratorial language, he forced conversations away from victims and toward his own narrative. He transformed interviews from investigations into dialogues about truth, perception, and social hypocrisy. As one observer from the recent docuseries put it, even in his final years, Manson remained lying through his teeth, more concerned with controlling his legacy than with justice or confession. Here's perhaps the most disturbing revelation from studying Manson's later interviews. Occasionally, the mask slipped, revealing not just a calculating psychopath, but a broken human being whose vulnerabilities help explain how he became so dangerous. In his 1993 jailhouse interview with Diane Sawyer, there are moments when Manson seemed to step out of his monstrous persona entirely. At one point, he says simply, "I know I don't know. I know I'm stupid." He calls himself incompetent, saying he has never been a success at anything. This raw self-deprecation, delivered not as calculated performance but as frank admission, offers a glimpse of someone profoundly damaged behind the terrifying myth. Such moments stand in stark contrast to the elaborate theatrical performances of his earlier years. Carving symbols on his forehead, having followers mimic self-mutilation, all the dramatic gestures designed to project himself as a guru or messianic figure. Recent psychological reevaluation, particularly a 2023 study led by researcher Joni Mahura, found that Manson's thinking in these later interviews wasn't disordered in the sense of schizophrenia. Rather, his thinking was organized and deliberate. What he exhibited were traits consistent with psychopathy and possibly hypomania, alternating between energetic, manic states and depressed, vulnerable ones. This ability to switch between modes made him far more dangerous than someone simply driven by delusion. In one moment, he could deliver wild, disturbing ramblings laden with apocalyptic visions and cryptic metaphors. That was the Manson the world saw, the cult leader and twisted guru. In another moment, particularly when he believed no formal audience was watching, he could drop the mask entirely. Statements like, "I'm a reflection of you," "I am only what you made me," or "I'm a tramp, a bum, a hobo," suggest there was still a human being underneath all the madness. As one former follower recalled, Manson told his group that when imprisoned, he might act strange and not making sense, until authorities let him go, but that would only be an act, a performance necessary for survival. This capacity to perform, to present himself differently depending on context, made him infinitely more dangerous than someone genuinely delusional. Psychologists describe this as instrumental delusion. Some of his extreme beliefs may have been genuinely held, but he also used them cynically to manipulate vulnerable people, offering them meaning and identity in exchange for absolute loyalty. Manson's power rested on emotional and psychological exploitation. He targeted people who felt lost, rejected, or socially outcast, offering them acceptance, love, and purpose. He used drugs, isolation, and group control to dismantle their individuality and make them dependent on him. His public image, manic, violent, theatrical, scary, was only half the story. That side generated fear and cemented his infamy. But the other side, the insecure, lonely man longing to belong, explains how he managed to seduce human beings into following him so completely. When pressed with tough questions by Diane Sawyer, researchers noted that Manson's intensity was very purposeful. He was trying to distract Sawyer from asking about his guilt and his part in the murders. This suggests calculated use of his crazy cult leader character, rather than unfiltered breakdown. Yet in private moments he allowed a different demeanor to emerge, admitting, "I know I don't know," accepting, "I'm a loser," calling himself incompetent. He revealed fragility, self-loathing, despair. In those moments, the monstrous figure softened into someone broken, someone who perhaps wanted not power over others, but recognition, acceptance, maybe even compassion. This tension between performance and vulnerability, between ruthless manipulation and human longing, forms the tragic core of Charles Manson's persona. It doesn't soften the horror of what he did. The bloodshed, cult indoctrination, and deaths remain. He remains guilty and monstrous. But understanding this duality helps explain how he exerted such powerful influence over lost, desperate people. As we close this deep dive into the mind of Charles Manson, what lingers isn't just the horror of his crimes, but the unsettling realization of how easily human vulnerability can be manipulated. These interviews reveal something far more disturbing than madness: a calculated understanding of fear, belonging, and control. Decades after his death, new investigations continue to challenge what we think we know. Was helter-skelter truly the motive, or a story crafted to hide something deeper? The recordings suggest Manson wasn't just commanding followers. He was studying them, mirroring their needs, and reshaping their identities. The most chilling truth is this: evil rarely looks like evil at first. It often sounds understanding. It feels comforting. It promises purpose. And the question that remains is, how many secrets did Manson take to the grave, and how much of the story are we still missing? To uncover the full analysis, rare interview breakdowns, and the unanswered questions we couldn't fit here, download the Scoob app now and listen to the complete episode. The full story is waiting, if you're ready to hear it.